Good afternoon, and welcome to the first lecture series in mathematics hosted by the Newark Board of Education. My name is Darlene Gearhart, and I'm the Director of Mathematics. The purpose of today's lecture is to expose teachers, principals, and the community at large to current research in mathematics education. Today we are joined by Arthur Powell, Miriam Rosenberg-Lee, and Roberto Abreu Mendoza from Rutgers University, Newark. Joining us from Instituto Federal in Brazil are Rogério Vio Pajeda Toledo and Maria Alice de Souza. If you have questions during the lecture, you may use the chat box for that purpose. Given the nature and volume of this forum, please remain on mute throughout the 5 lectures. Please non-verbally welcome our very own Arthur Powell as we learn about aligning neuroscientific mathematics education research to understand rational number cognition.
Thank you, Director Darlene Gearhart. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I can see from the participant list that many friends and colleagues from Newark and elsewhere in the United States are present. As the principal investigator of the grants that supported our work, I want to thank both the Mathematics Education Trust of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics and Rutgers Global of Rutgers University. Our Rutgers Global grant specifically supported our research collaboration with our 2 Brazilian colleagues and today's report to the community workshop. As our flyer indicates, we have 5 investigators who will present aspects of their work from their disciplinary perspective. Each will talk for approximately 15 minutes. 4 of us will speak in English with English language slides. To give you a flavor of our cross-cultural collaboration, one of our presenters will actually deliver her talk and slides in Portuguese, but with English subtitles. I will present first, so now I'll only introduce the others. After me, Dr. Rosenberg-Lee will explore the neuroscience perspective of rational number thinking. Afterwards, her doctoral student, Roberto Abreu Mendoza, will discuss non-symbolic proportional reasoning among 2nd grade students in Newark. Our third presenter is a newly minted doctor, Dr. Rogério Toledo, who studied with Dr. Rosenberg-Lee and also observed the implementation of a teaching experiment of mine in the Newark Elementary School. She will present in Portuguese with English subtitles about teachers' strategies in comparing the magnitudes of non-symbolic and symbolic ratios or fractions. Last but not least, Dr. Maria Alice de Souza will discuss a model of teacher professional learning through which teachers taught students our approach to fraction learning. As Darlene has said, after the presentations, we will entertain questions and comments. Please send them via WebEx chat function. And so now we'll turn to my talk. Thank you. Hello. I'm going to characterize 2 perspectives of fraction knowledge, discuss their origins and implications of these perspectives. Knowledge of fractions uniquely predicts understanding and performance in algebra and higher mathematics. Not only in New Jersey or in the United States, but in many countries, students experience difficulty comprehending and operating with fractions. Now, these difficulties that students have coexist with current curricular guides, with textbooks that we use, with popular manipulatives used in classrooms, as well as with reform pedagogical practices. But all of these are based on a particular ontological and epistemological perspective for teaching fractions. So we're going to look at 2 different models for representing fractions and discuss the cognitive and mathematical attributes of each model. Model 1 will notice that in figure A and B, we have single quantities. In model A, we have a region that's been subdivided into equal parts. A certain number of those parts are shaded. And the fraction represented here, we can say, is 2/7. Or we can also say that these other fractions are represented by figure A. In figure B, the green point, which exists halfway between the fourth and fifth tick marks on the line, represents the fraction 7/8. But also figure B can be used to represent any one of these other fractions, for example. In model 2, we'll notice that we have two distinct quantities that we're comparing. In figure C, we have a blue and a purple quantity. In figure D, we have a length that's colored light green, colored dark green, the other is orange. And they represent these Cuisenaire rods. And the Cuisenaire rods, the smallest is a white rod, and each of the other rods is a certain multiple of the white rod. And so the blue rod being equivalent to 9 white rods and the purple rod measuring 4 white rods, we can say that figure C represents a fraction 9/4, or 2 1/4, 2 purple rods and a fourth of a purple rod, or these other fractions can be seen as represented in figure C. Figure D, we can take the red rod as the unit of measure and see that the dark green rod is equivalent to 3 red rods and the orange rod equivalent to 5 red rods, so that the fraction represented is 3/5. Or we can use the white rod as the unit of measure and say that the fraction represented is 6/10. And we have these other fractions, which are also can be seen as represented in figure D. So what are the cognitive and mathematical attributes of each of these models? Model 1, we see that we always have one equipartitioned or discretized quantity or whole, that the model invites counting, a certain number of parts that have been shaded or the number of tick marks. The whole is implicit, or as a teacher once told me, preordained. The unit fraction is also predetermined. And so in model 1, a fraction denotes a count of discrete entities, the number of highlighted parts to the total number of parts. Model 2, the attributes are different. We have two distinct continuous quantities shown in each of the figures, C and D. In order to determine what fraction is being represented, it necessitates either estimating or actually measuring. One quantity is the explicit unit. The unit fraction, therefore, has to be determined. And here in model 2, a fraction expresses a multiplicative relation. One quantity is measured by another quantity of the same kind. So these two fraction models, we're going to say, represent perspectives. Model 1, the partitioning perspective. Model 2, we can call it a measuring perspective. Comparing these perspectives, we see that in the measuring perspective, we always have two distinct quantities, and there are decisions that have to be made in terms of which of the two quantities is the unit of measure. Whereas in the partitioning perspective, the whole is given, and it's already subdivided so that the unit fraction is also determined. So the partitioning perspective, things are given. The measuring perspective, one has to make decisions. These have origins, these perspectives. One is historical, and the other is philosophical. The historical perspectives brings us back to ancient Egypt, where fractions, written versions of fractions, were first invented. We know that Egypt has these 3 major periods. In the old period, there was already evidence of engineering and written writing in ancient Egypt, where numbers, fractions, and other ideas were represented in hieroglyphics. We have, from the new period of Egypt, evidence of the instruments that were used for measuring. Here we have a cubic, or a knotted rope used for measuring distances. Surveyors, you would stretch knotted ropes to measure the dimensions of a property. The knots were arranged in a uniform intervals. These are units. And when measuring a terrain, it was not always the case that it measured an exact multiple of the unit of measure. So when the unit, or the length rather, was not an exact multiple of the unit, there was a need for fractional lengths. And we can notice that the fractional lengths are multiplicative comparisons between two quantities, the dimension of land and the unit of measure. Later, of course, Greeks will note that the quantities had to be commensurate, that is, they had to have a common unit. Otherwise, the multiplicative comparison would result in an irrational number. So the ancient Egyptians had two forms of writing fractions. One was for writing unit fractions, where they used their symbols for integers with an oval above it. So here we have 1/3. The oval is above the hieroglyphics for 3. And then there were special fractions who had their own hieroglyphic symbols, 1/2, 2/3, 3/4. So those were invented about 4 millennia ago. But it took mathematicians centuries in order to accept fractions as legitimate mathematical objects. Eventually, it was understood that fractions could allow equations of the form ax equals b to have solutions, where a is not equal to 0, and that this would provide meaning for the division of any two natural numbers, and that it resulted in this closed algebraic system called an algebraic field. Now, the other perspective of fractions, the partitioning perspective, it emerges from a philosophical position that David Hilbert, the geometer, had, which he called formalism. And formalism was the idea of taking a finite number of axioms to build all of mathematics. Hilbert, being a geometer, was very impressed with the way axioms in geometry allowed one to elaborate geometric theories. And for him, mathematics is a game played according to certain simple rules with meaningless marks on paper. So the formalists maintain that the objects of mathematical thinking are the mathematical symbols themselves and not any meaning attributed to them. This philosophical belief permeated mathematics education. And as a consequence, the formalist idea of what rational numbers are was defined in this rather formal way. Rational numbers, represented as common fractions, are bipartite symbols that express quotients or ratios of two whole numbers, a over b, such that a and b are whole numbers and b is different from 0. Of course, for the teaching of fractions in schools, this formalist definition of a fraction doesn't provide a visualization to students. And so a way of visualizing fractions was developed based on partitioning or dividing up area. And so we have these examples from textbooks in use currently where fractions are presented and defined using this area model and dividing up and partitioning area. This is the part-whole perspective of fractions. What are some implications of this perspective? One implication is that students oftentimes inappropriately apply their whole number knowledge to evaluate fractions, so that the fraction 1/4 is considered to be larger than 1/3 because 4 is larger than 3, or that fraction arithmetic behaves the way whole number arithmetic, so that adding 1/2 and 1/3, we just add across the bipartite symbols, and so 1/2 and 1/3 is equal to 2/5. Or that if we just partition a region, we can, and there are 3 parts, one part of it is considered to be 1/3. Also, the part-whole definition of a fraction, that is, by saying that a fraction is defined as parts of a whole, doesn't provide meaning for improper fractions, so that how does a fraction, an improper fraction, can be represented geometrically when the numerator says that there are more parts than there are in the whole. Well, we want to also look at implications of implementing a measuring perspective. We have a certain position on what we call fraction sense, where the idea of magnitude is at the center of what it means to have fraction sense. We move from non-symbolic to symbolic visualizations of fractions. Flexibility and reasonableness are two important concepts that one needs to have strong fraction sense. And those we can discuss in more detail at another moment. But what I want to point out is that there is an interesting connection between cognitive neuroscience and the measuring perspective, because there's a growing body of evidence that demonstrates that humans have a ratio processing system. That is, this neurocognitive architecture that supports comparing magnitudes of two non-symbolic ratios. And that there's an important link that can be made between non-symbolic continuous models of ratios and fractions and the symbolic version of fractions. So our question in some research that we've engaged with is, how can we help students use their reasoning about non-symbolic continuous ratios to think about symbolic fractions? In order to implement this perspective, we engage students in manipulating physical objects, Cuisenaire rods. We engage them in identifying the unit of measure, comparing and operating with these magnitudes, and later translating their ideas of these non-symbolic fractions into symbolic fractions. And we transition from what we call fractions of quantity to fractions as number. Of course, the materials that we're using are Cuisenaire rods. And we start off by having students manipulate the rods, and then without the rods present, write down what they have noticed about them. In this case, using inequality signs to talk about the absolute magnitude of different rods. These second graders also construct multiplicative structures in order that they can perceive and talk about fractions. So they look at and measure a rod with another rod and talk about the fractional relationship between the two entities. Here in this picture, we see that the students are selecting units and measuring the length of the blue rod. And what do they find? That an exact multiple of the white rod can be used to measure the blue rod, but not the red rod. But that the red rod is, the length of the blue rod is equivalent to 4.5 red rods. So the multiplicative comparison between two quantities becomes their idea of fraction. And they begin to use language to talk about things. The length of the purple rod equals the length of 2 red rods. Or in a shorter form, the brown rod equals 2 purple rods. And in terms of fractions of quantity, the length of the purple rod equals 1/2 the length of the brown rod, or the length of the dark green rod equals 3/2 of the purple rod's length and 6/4 of the length of the purple rod. They write their fractions of quantity expressions without the rods present. So these are expressions that are on the basis of images that they evoke in their mind of the rod relationships that they've been exploring. And then ultimately they compare symbolically the magnitudes of fractions of quantities, such as this student writing on the board that 3/4 of the purple rod is less than 5/7 of the ebony rod. And other students contribute their noticings from on the basis of images that they've evoked in their mind. And that's what I wanted to present to you this afternoon. Thank you for your attention. We will now hear from Dr. Miriam Rosenberg-Lee.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm so excited to tell you about the work that we've been doing at the Mathematics, Reasoning, and Learning Lab right here at Rutgers University in Newark. So the title of my talk is Exploring the Brain Basis of Rational Number Processing. And you might be wondering, what can learning about this kind of wet, squishy biological organ of the brain tell us about the uniquely human process of learning mathematics? And to begin to answer that question, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how we measure the brain and what kind of information it can give us. And to do that, we're going to start with an activity. So I'm going to show you two sets of dots. Ordinarily, I'd ask you to call out the answer, but here, just think in your mind, which side is larger, the left or the right? Now that was presented really briefly, but you should have been able to tell that there were more dots on the left than on the right. Now we're going to do another one. Now that was probably a lot harder for you. And in fact, there were still more dots on the left and the right, but it was much harder to tell because the difference between them was much closer. Now I'm going to give you the same examples, but this time with numerals. Again, this one should be easy, whereas this one should be harder. And what's interesting is that in the first case, you can see that the number of dots is going to make it harder or easier to tell, but we seem to have the same effect when we're processing number symbols. And so from an experimental perspective, we can think of these kinds of stimuli which are differ by 1 as being near on the number line, whereas these problems which differ by 6 are far apart on the number line. So let's keep this difference in mind as I tell you a little bit about how we study the brain. So you may have seen images like this, perhaps where we're sort of cutting through the brains of adults and children, and we've got these colorful blobs. Or we could have these kind of cool 3D rendered brains, again with these colorful blobs on them. And so how we get these is we do something called functional neuroimaging. And we use the same MRI machine that you might go to if you maybe injure your knee, but instead of measuring a knee, we have a child lie down in the scanner and we measure their brain. And we have this contraption around their head which helps us pick up the signals, but also has a mirror on it, which is facing a projector behind the scanner that you can't see, which is showing math problems to the child while they're in the scanner. And so they might see problems just like the ones I just showed you. So for example, these easy problems with the far distance and these harder problems with the near distance. And while they're answering those problems, they're, instead of calling out, they're using their index and middle finger to indicate the left or the right side of the screen. We don't want them talking and moving in the scanner because then the pictures are blurry. So while they're in the scanner, they're working hard, and it turns out that the harder an area of the brain is working, the more energy it needs. So neurons are firing, are sending electrical signals, and they're using energy. And to replenish their energy, the blood is sending them hemoglobin with oxygen on it. And it turns out that deoxygenated hemoglobin is slightly magnetic and has a lower magnetic signal than the neutral oxygenated hemoglobin, which has a higher signal. So with this MRI machine, which is the M is for magnetic, we're measuring the magnetic signal in different parts of the brain. And the parts of the brain that are working hardest are going to have elevated signal. And so we might get a signal out there, signal out of the brain that looks like this. So in each location of the brain, we might see something like this. To be honest, this is much cleaner than the real data, but it'll be good enough for our purposes. And while we're getting the signal, the child is seeing these kinds of problems. And we might notice that for these harder problems, there are more activity than for the easier problems that differ by 1. And so with a little bit more complicated statistics, but in general, what we do is kind of average together the signal for the hard task and the easy task. And so you might see something like this, where you've got greater activity for the hard task than the easy task, and we can turn this into a statistical test and color code the brain. So the bigger the difference between the hard and the easy task, the brighter the color is on the brain. And in our example, we could look at the difference between near and far problems. Now, when we study the brain, there are lots of areas that are involved, but today we're going to really be concentrating on this parietal region, which is involved in calculation and number processing. And so in the case of these distance effects that we just talked about, if we're showing people these non-symbolic stimuli and we show them to adults, we find greater activity in this parietal lobe region. We're looking at the brain cut through like this and up here. We're going to see greater activity in the region called the interparietal sulcus, which I'll use sometimes the term IPS, or the parietal lobe. And they're going to have greater activity for near than far problems. And if we give these same problems to kids, they're also going to show this pattern. So it suggests that this kind of difference between sets of dots is something that kids can do maybe innately. Even younger children show these effects. And now we can ask, well, what's happening in this part of the brain that processes non-symbolic magnitude for number symbols? And of course, number symbols are something that we have to learn. We learn them at home, we learn them in school. Nobody is born automatically knowing that, this squiggle is bigger than this squiggle. But if you show these symbols to adults in the same part of the brain, now we're looking at the brain cut through like this, we see greater activity for near than far problems. But if we show them to children, we don't see this activity. And so that tells us that it takes a lot of experience and practice with numbers to get the parietal lobe to show this sort of automatic coding of the magnitude. So working harder for near than far problems. And so we can say that with learning, the parietal lobe comes to respond to the magnitude of whole number symbols. Now we can finally turn to our key question, which is what makes rational numbers difficult to learn? And the big idea that sort of pushes our work forward is that rational numbers are difficult because our prior knowledge about whole numbers interferes with our learning about rationals. And so if we wanted to look for something to support this idea from the brain, we would want to see, well, where does the brain process rational numbers? We know that this parietal lobe area processes whole numbers, and so if there's interference, we might expect rational numbers to be processed there as well. And what happens in the brain when there's interference between whole and rational numbers? When the whole number is taking you one way and the rational number is taking you a different way. So to answer that first question, we did a little study where we just took the kinds of non-symbolic rational number representations, so things like pie charts and bar charts and maybe sets of dots, and we looked at studies that had used those stimuli. And I'm going to show you studies using these dots, lines, and pies overlaid on brain. So underneath here in orange are brain areas that are important for processing whole number non-symbolic stimuli. And there's dozens of studies, and so we get these nice blobs of activity, that's the technical term, going along our favorite area, this parietal lobe area. And we can see that in the few studies that have used these non-symbolic stimuli, you find activity in very similar areas. Now, what if we turn to symbolic stimuli? Well, here we can also see for fractions and decimals, again, whole number comparison tasks underneath, and on top of them in these colored circles and squares are areas for fractions and decimals. So this is telling us that when people are looking at fractions and decimals, they're using their parietal lobe. But we don't know if they're just processing the individual whole numbers or if they're really processing the magnitude of the rational number symbols that they're observing. So to do that, we developed a task that uses decimal comparison. So again, I'm going to have you think in your mind which side is larger, the left or the right. And so here's the stimulus. I'm going to leave it up because this is actually a pretty tricky question. And if you ask kids that, if you ask them, they might say that 0.36 is bigger than 0.9. And that's because, of course, they've learned that double-digit numbers are bigger than single-digit numbers. And if they don't really understand what the decimal point means, they might come to that conclusion. And the interesting thing is, if you ask adults this, they'll probably most of the time get the right answer, but it'll take them longer than if we gave them a question like 0.3 versus 0.96. And I'll tell you that we measure those. I'm not going to show you them today, and that's because the way that people solve them, they can just be using their whole number. We're looking for these places where your whole and rational are in conflict. So this is a pretty tough problem, but I'm going to make it even tougher on this next example. So here, again, the single digit is bigger than the double digit, but also these numbers are much closer together. These are a near comparison. And studies have shown that people also process the magnitude of rational numbers, and they're going to have greater activity for near than far problems in rational number space. So now I'm going to make this problem even harder. So now we're still 2.09 apart, but now if you were ignoring the decimal points, this might be an even harder problem because now you're comparing 9 to 81, and that's really pushing you towards the rational, towards the whole number response. So let's look at all of these stimuli together. So here are the comparisons. And if we think that people are just paying attention to the actual magnitude of these numbers, then this one's going to be a lot harder than this one because this one is a lot closer together. And now so this is going to be a near versus far in rational distance. But now let's add on this other one. So these are the same difficulty in terms of rational distance, but if you're ignoring that decimal point, 4 versus 31 is hard, but 9 versus 81 is even farther pushing you towards the wrong answer. And so in terms of whole distance when you're ignoring the decimal place, these ones are not too bad, but this one is really hard. And so here we might expect that the far problems, because they're far in whole distance, are going to be the hardest. Now, if people are just processing, if just thinking about the rational number, then these two problems should not be differing in difficulty. So what do we see in behavior? Well, indeed, people make more errors on these near versus far problems in rational distance, and they tend to be slower on them than for the far problems. However, when we turn to whole distance, now we're finding that the far problems are twice as difficult as the near problems. And interestingly, when we look at their reaction times, we're only actually looking at their correct trials, and we don't see any difference between them. And that tells us that if they're getting the answer right, it's almost as if they have to learn to ignore the whole number distance in order to get that right. Now, what do we see in the brain? So in our favorite parietal region, we're going to see we see what we expect to see, which is that there's greater activity for near than far problems on both the left and the right parietal lobe. And if we turn to whole distance, we actually see this weird effect, but the one we expect, which is that there's greater activity for far than near problems. So people are working harder when the whole number information is pushing them in the wrong direction. And these lines are the individual participants, and almost every single one of them is showing this effect of working harder. So to come back to our big questions, where does the brain process rational numbers? It's processing them in those same regions that are used for whole numbers. And What happens when there's interference? The parietal lobe is working harder when there's more interference from the whole numbers, when whole number knowledge contradicts rational numbers. So together, this tells us that adults are processing whole number interference. And it leads to a bunch of really interesting next questions. How does rational number patterns change with learning? So this is what adults are doing. What are kids doing? Kids might not even notice that there's a interference here, and they might just be processing them as whole numbers, getting it wrong and showing the opposite effects. And so we're interested in seeing how those change with just regular schooling. But what we're really interested in is what is the effect of instruction, and can we change those brain patterns? So we could think about two different kinds of instructions. One which maybe just removes the interference, like if you added a 0 in your mind onto the single digit single digit number, you might then sort of remove that interference. Or you might want to think about those numbers in terms of their magnitude. And so in both of these instructions, you might get better at the task behaviorally. But we could use brain imaging to say, well, does your whole number interference effect go down? And does your rational number magnitude effect go up? And that could be a place where we could see that brain data tells us something that the behavioral data cannot. And then, of course, the key question is, well, which kind of instruction is going to most help people get to that mature pattern of brain activity? And we saw that non-symbolic stimuli are also processed in these parietal lobe regions. And I told you that for whole numbers, we're sort of learning to make a mapping between that symbol 8 and that magnitude 8. And so we would love to see if instructing people to make a mapping between a representation of a half and the number symbol 1/2 or 0.5 improves people's performance on these kinds of tasks and in later kinds of working with rational numbers. And so we can think about what is the effect of non-symbolic proportional reasoning on brain activity patterns and then future learning. So I'll end here by thanking my co-presenters and other people in the lab who worked on these projects, and of course the participants for sharing their brains with us. Thank you.
And next, we'll hear from Roberto Abreu Mendoza.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roberto Abreu, and I'm a PhD student at Rutgers University, Newark. The work that I will present today is a collaboration between the Mathematics, Reasoning, and Learning Lab and Dr. Arthur Powell. And the title of my presentation is Children's Non-Symbolic Proportional Knowledge, Cognitive Correlates and Intervention Effects. Teaching fractions is a major educational challenge. There is a large percentage of students that have difficulties at comparing and performing arithmetical problems that involve fractions. This is critical as fraction knowledge not only has an impact on everyday activities such as cooking, but also on people's academic outcomes, employability, and even on their health. This problem is so obvious that even pharmaceuticals are changing the way that they are representing their adequate dosage. And it's no coincidence that these representations are non-symbolic, as we can compare with relatively ease non-symbolic continuous proportions. For example, if I ask you to compare the proportionally larger red area of these two figures, probably you won't have any trouble to choose the left figure as the figure with the proportionally larger red area. However, the easiness disappears when there is discrete information, and now one has to ignore the fact that in this case, the figure on the left has the smaller number of pieces, but still has the proportionally larger red area. Research with children have shown that they have some knowledge about non-symbolic continuous proportions. For instance, 6 to 10-year-olds can reliably indicate the proportionally larger gray area of these two figures. However, children's skills plummets when they encounter discrete information, in particular when the proportional information is at odds with discrete information. For example, performance of 10-year-olds is no better than guessing. Given the associations between proportional reasoning and formal fraction ability, recent research has looked at the cognitive abilities associated with non-symbolic proportional reasoning, and this research has shown that proportional reasoning is in continuous but not discrete context is related to analogical reasoning. One candidate cognitive ability to contribute to the discrete proportional reasoning is the inhibitory control. This ability allows overriding strong predispositions. For example, if I ask you to name the color ink of this word, you will have to use your inhibitory control to override the automatic response of naming the written information, that is saying red instead of green. And studies have shown that inhibitory control is related to the ability to ignore conflicting information in science. And recently, students have also found a relationship between inhibitory control and symbolic proportional reasoning, with fractions and decimals in other children and adults. There is also a recent interest in examining the malleability of non-symbolic proportional reasoning throughout interventions. In a recent study, children went through a 5-day computerized intervention in which they have to solve non-symbolic proportional problems that comprise indicating how much a combination of water and juice they would taste of a strawberry. Results show that children not only improve in their non-symbolic proportional reasoning, but also their ability to solve problems with symbolic proportions. However, some of the limitations of this study were the lack of ecological validity, as the training involved performing individually computerized tasks, and its high cost, as each child required a computer. In the current study, we aim to answer 3 research questions. The first one is better inhibitory control associated with better proportional reasoning in discrete contexts? The second one, can continuous and discrete proportional reasoning be improved through intervention? And the third one, does better inhibitory control predict larger learning gains in discrete contexts? To preview, we found that yes, children with higher inhibitory control had better proportional reasoning, particularly in contexts where discrete information was at odds with proportional knowledge. Yes, children improved their continuous proportional reasoning after a questionnaire intervention. However, discrete proportional knowledge was hindered. And no, children with lower inhibitory control were those to show larger learning gains. Now I'm going to show you how we come to these answers. We first evaluated 49 second graders who yet to receive fraction instruction from a Newark public school. Before the intervention started, all children went through an assessment which, among other measures, included a measure of inhibitory control, the hearts and flowers task, a measure of proportional reasoning, the spinner's task. And to answer our first question, that is whether inhibitory control is associated with proportional reasoning, We're going to look at the relationship between these two measures. In the spinner's task, our measure of proportional reasoning, children were shown a pair of spinners and asked to choose the proportionally larger red area across two formats. The continuous format, in which the spinners were only divided into two segments, the red and the blue, and the discrete adjacent, in which the blue and red segments were further divided into smaller segments. In this format, the number of segments could be consistent with the proportional information, and those were counting consistent, or they could be misleading. That is, now the spinner with the larger proportional red area was the one with the smaller number of segments. In the Hearts and Flowers task, children had to press a key as soon as they saw a figure. As more specifically, in the Hearts block, they have to press on the same side as where the figure appeared. On the Flowers block, they have to press on the opposite side as where the flowers appear. And in the Mix block, they saw interspersed hearts and flowers. As expected, in the pre-training session, children had a lower performance in the trials that require the most inhibitory control demands, that is, the Mix block. But what about the spinner's task? Before the intervention, children reliably chose the spinner with the proportionally larger red area in the continuous format. However, children in the discrete adjacent format were only able to choose the correct spinner in the consistent trials, but fail in the misleading trials. And in this case, the performance was not better than guessing. And these trials were the ones in which the proportional information and the counting information was at odds. More importantly, we found that children who had higher scores in the Hearts and Flowers task were also better at this type of trials, the misleading trials. Notably, this relationship was not as strong with performance in the continuous format or even in the discrete format. These results suggest that it's not the overall difficulty of the format or the discrete information by itself, but the conflict between the discrete and proportional information that links proportional reasoning with inhibitory control. To answer whether proportional reasoning is malleable, we divided children into two groups. A group of 14 children who participated in the intervention and a group of 15 children who formed the control group. The intervention comprised two phases. In the first phase, children became familiarized with Kushner rods and manipulated absolute magnitudes, physically, orally, and symbolically. And in the second phase, children represented and compared non-symbolic and symbolic proportions. Notably, during both phases, children initially worked with physical rods and then slowly transitions to use letters to refer to the rods. After the 24 sessions, children in the intervention group and children in the control group completed the post-intervention assessment, which comprised the same measures as the pre-assessment, that is, the inhibitory control task and the proportional reasoning task. In particular, we were interested in whether children of the intervention group were able to transfer the recently acquired knowledge of symbolic proportions and proportions of lengths to area models like the ones they use in the spinner's task. So going from proportions represented as Kushner rods to proportions represented as area models as the spinners. We first look at learning gains in the continuous format. We found that children in the control group did not show any change in their performance as expected. In contrast, children in the intervention group show reliable changes in their ability to compare continuous proportions. Then we look at changes in the discrete adjacent format. In the consistent trials, we found a small but not significant increase. However, and unexpectedly, we found that children in the intervention group decreased their performance in the county misleading trials. And remember, these county misleading trials are where the proportional and the counting information are at odds. In contrast, children in the control group did not show any change. So the performance in the consistent and misleading trials remained the same after this period of time. Finally, we investigated whether performance during the pre-intervention assessment was related to changes in the continuous and discrete misleading format. However, contrary to our expectations, we found a negative relationship between inhibitory control and learning gains in both continuous and discrete format, suggesting that children with low inhibitory control were those who show larger learning gains after the intervention. Notably, these relationships were not found in the control group. To summarize, we found that children with higher inhibitory control had very proportional reasoning, particularly in contexts where discrete information was at odds with proportional knowledge. Second, we found that children improved their continuous proportional reasoning after the questionnaire intervention. However, they decrease in their discrete proportional skills. And finally, we found that children with lower inhibitory control were those to show larger learning gains. The next questions that we would like to shed light on are: how can we improve non-symbolic and symbolic proportional reasoning in conflicting contexts? That is, in which ways can we help students to overcome the conflicting and misleading discrete information? And the second question is, how do cognitive abilities interact with different types of instructions? Here, we found that intensive conceptual training helped children with low inhibitory control. However, other studies have found that training that focuses on teaching procedural steps help children with higher cognitive skills. Finally, I would like to finish by thanking all the people who participated in the study and the MLK school and the students who participated in the study. And thank you all for your attention.
Next, we have the pleasure of hearing from Rogeria Toledo.
Boa tarde, pessoal. Meu nome é Rogéria. Eu venho apresentar para vocês hoje parte da minha pesquisa de doutorado, que versa sobre as dificuldades e estratégias de professores ao comparar frações no formato simbólico e não simbólico. Primeiro, por que é importante a gente discutir isso, né? Nós precisamos compreender quais são os processos cognitivos envolvidos no processamento de frações por professores de matemática, para que depois de delinear quais são esses pensamentos do professor, quais são os conhecimentos dele, como eles processam frações, a gente poder levar isso para a sala de aula e aplicar com os nossos alunos, né? Então, a gente já sabe o histórico de frações como um conteúdo em que as crianças, né, tanto crianças quanto professores, apresentam dificuldades, então a gente precisa organizar e pensar como que está esse conhecimento. Para isso, nessa investigação, nós utilizamos 3 grandes áreas de resultados de pesquisa, né? Então, a gente trabalhou com pesquisas de neurociência cognitiva, de psicologia cognitiva e comportamental e de educação matemática. A gente analisou resultados de diversas pesquisas dessas áreas para poder delinear a nossa investigação. 49 participantes fizeram parte do estudo, né? Quem eram esses participantes? Eram professores de matemática, licenciados, e eles estavam fazendo algum curso de pós-graduação na área de educação, tá? Então, nós pegamos diversos estados brasileiros, 5 diferentes instituições de ensino brasileiras. Aqui eu trago para vocês um pouco da grande discussão teórica que embasou esse trabalho, né? A primeira grande discussão é sobre magnitude. Nós temos que a magnitude foi declarada como um principal parâmetro para que os alunos precisam ter o domínio para poder começar a pensar em frações, né? Quando a gente discute conhecimento conceitual versus processual, a gente está falando sobre o aluno compreender fração em si, sobre o que significa, qual que é a magnitude daquele número e dos processos que envolvem frações, como adição, subtração, multiplicação. Muitas vezes a gente vai direto para esses processos e não dá a devida importância ao conceito de fração, né, a essa magnitude. Nisso, foi percebido que existe um viés do número natural que impede com que os alunos enxerguem a fração como uma visão holística, ou seja, que enxerguem a fração como um todo. 7/4 representa um valor e eles dimensionem esse valor. A visão componencial, ela é uma visão influenciada pelo viés do número natural, pois o aluno ele olha o denominador e o numerador e compara somente o tamanho desses números separadamente. Ele não vê a fração como um todo, né? Um outro grande foco de estudo é a questão do conhecimento simbólico versus não simbólico. O simbólico seriam as frações no formato numérico, né? E o não simbólico são as representações em figuras. A grande discussão tem sido em torno de particionamento e de condições contínuas. Numa pesquisa norte-americana com crianças, eles apresentaram figuras como essas barrinhas aqui embaixo, e eles perceberam que nas barrinhas que eram particionadas, os alunos tenderam a contar assim, marcando a opção errada, como a barrinha proporcional apresentada. Na condição contínua, eles foram melhor. Então, a gente quer analisar um pouco isso também aqui nessa pesquisa, né? Para isso, nós utilizamos o teste de comparação de frações. É um teste que apresentava duas frações, né, um par de frações, em que os professores tinham que fazer a comparação, então eles apertavam a tecla, né, do teclado do computador, que era referente à fração que ele achava maior. Nós medíamos tanto o acerto quanto o tempo que ele demorou para responder. Como que foram montadas essas frações? Nós tivemos 90 pares no total, é um teste adaptado de Oberstein e colegas, e esse teste foi montado em função do viés do número natural, ou seja, do pensamento componencial, né? Então, a gente tinha casos congruentes, incongruentes, mesmos termos, né? Assim, mesmo numerador, mesmo denominador, e era de acordo com se ele analisaria componencialmente as frações ou holisticamente, certo? Então, para vocês entenderem o que seria esse pensamento holístico, na fração, no par 7 nonos e 3/21, aquele que escolhesse a fração 7 nonos, ele vai ir por um pensamento holístico. Por quê? Porque 0,77 é o valor referente a essa fração e 0,61 é referente a outra. Ele realmente escolheu a maior fração, certo? Aquele que tivesse um pensamento componencial, ele escolheria a fração 13/21. Por quê? Porque ele olharia os componentes da fração. 13 é maior que 7, 21 é maior que 9. Então, a fração 13/21 seria maior. Então, a gente queria avaliar se os professores tinham esse pensamento também e eram influenciados pelo viés do número natural. O efeito da distância foi o parâmetro utilizado para a nossa análise. Então, se ele utilizasse o pensamento holístico, a distância absoluta que tomaria como foco, né, na análise. Se eles olhassem os componentes, seria a distância entre os numeradores e os denominadores. Por que isso? Porque a gente deduz que, supõe, né, pelos resultados das pesquisas, que quanto mais distante são as frações, mais fácil deles avaliarem, né, e mais rápido eles seriam em relação às duas frações dadas, certo? Como resultado nesse teste, nós chegamos que eles não tiveram um pensamento componencial, realmente, mas um pouco a mais precisava ser analisado. E para isso a gente fez o teste de comparação de frações justificada. Qual que foi esse teste? Esse teste apresentou para a gente, apresentou para eles 7 pares de frações, né? Então aqui a gente tem 7 pares escolhidos dentre aqueles 90, e eles tinham que justificar qual foi o motivo da escolha que eles fizeram para poder decidir qual a maior fração. Então, eles tinham que explicar a estratégia que ele utilizou para poder descobrir, tá? E selecionar. Nesse caso, a gente mostra os 7 pares e a gente mostra a porcentagem que cada par conseguiu de acerto entre os participantes, tá? E aí, vocês veem que as porcentagens são bem diferentes. E o que que leva um par de fração ser mais fácil, eles acertarem mais, e outro par ser mais difícil, né? Eles errarem mais? É uma coisa que a gente precisava analisar. Analisando as respostas, nós categorizamos todas elas, fizemos análise de conteúdo e fizemos algumas categorias. 4 grandes categorias foram referente à perspectiva da transformação, são aqueles participantes que usaram algum método de transformar as frações para poder comparar elas depois, né? Então, divisão, multiplicação cruzada, transformar para frações equivalentes com o mesmo denominador. Outra perspectiva é a perspectiva das partes, em que ele vai olhar o princípio do numerador, do denominador, que é quanto maior o numerador, maior a fração. Quanto maior o denominador, menor a fração. E aí surgiram 2 estratégias, que nós denominamos de gap e de fit. O que seria a gap? A gap é a diferença, é a distância entre o numerador e o denominador da fração. O sujeito, ele que utiliza essa estratégia, ele pensa assim: quando os 2 termos da fração são muito próximos, quer dizer que a fração é maior, certo? Então, ele olha a distância entre os componentes da fração. A fit, ele já olha a proporção entre os componentes. Então, tipo, quantas vezes o numerador cabe dentro do denominador? E aí, quanto menor seria a fit, maior seria a fração também, tá? Outras 2 perspectivas, a perspectiva do ponto de referência, em que eles utilizam pontos para comparar, por exemplo, essa fração é maior que 1/2 e essa é menor que 1/2. E a última é a perspectiva dos componentes, em que ele olha só o viés do número natural. Mas, como a gente já falou, pelo teste anterior, a gente já viu que eles não avaliaram componencialmente os 90 pares. Então, provavelmente aqui também isso não aconteceria. E realmente foi isso que a gente chegou. Então, olha lá, a perspectiva mais utilizada foi a perspectiva das partes, e isso faz sentido porque no Brasil, historicamente, o que a gente mais utiliza para ensinar frações não simbolicamente é a parte todo, né? Então, a gente tem muito essa relação entre as partes. Depois, a perspectiva da transformação e assim sucessivamente. Das subcategorias, a gente percebeu que a gap foi a estratégia mais utilizada. Então, em mais de 25% das vezes, os participantes utilizaram a estratégia gap. Tá? Então, eles avaliavam a distância entre o numerador e o denominador para poder definir a maior fração. Seguidas, né, divisão e outros. Aqui eu trago para vocês alguns exemplos de fala dos participantes para vocês entenderem um pouco. Olha a gap. Um participante que utilizou essa estratégia, ele falou: como estratégia, olhei para a diferença entre o numerador e o denominador. Optei pela menor diferença entre eles para escolher a maior fração. Por exemplo, 6/7 e 6/15. Na primeira a diferença é 1 e na segunda a diferença é 9. Então, escolhi a primeira como a maior fração. Aqui eu trago o exemplo das outras perspectivas que foram mais utilizadas também, né? Que seria da divisão, a do numerador e do denominador, e o princípio do denominador. Essas foram as 4 mais utilizadas por eles. Só que o que é importante a gente destacar aqui agora? A gap não é uma estratégia válida matematicamente. Ela tem lógica? Tem. Mas ela funciona em todos os casos? Não. Né? Então, aqui eu trago alguns exemplos para vocês de 3 pares que faziam parte daqueles 7 que a gente passou para eles, e é isso que influenciou naquela porcentagem de acerto de cada um. Por quê? Porque lá apareceu, por exemplo, a fração 6/17 e 5/8. Nessas frações, a primeira gap é 11, a diferença entre os termos da fração. A segunda é 3. Então, realmente, vocês veem que a maior fração é a maior gap. A maior fração tem a menor gap. Então, aqui trata-se de um caso congruente. Por quê? Porque se ele avaliou a diferença entre os termos e escolheu a menor diferença para a maior fração, daria certo. Era a estratégia que funcionaria. Porém, a gente apresentou também para eles esse par, em que a maior fração tinha a maior gap. Então, se ele fez a diferença e ele escolheu a gap 28 para a maior fração, ele ia ter marcado a opção errada. Tá? Então, esse é um caso incongruente, em que a gap não funciona. E aqui a gente tem o caso da gap ser neutra, que a gente chamou de neutra, que seria o quê? Tanto a gap da primeira fração quanto da segunda fração eram iguais. Então, os próprios participantes, durante o processo, eles falaram, então aqui a fração tinha que ser a mesma, né? As frações tinham que ser equivalentes, porque se tem a mesma gap, mas não são. Então, a minha estratégia não é válida. Eles mesmos perceberam, né, durante o processo, que a estratégia não era válida. Isso que fez com em relação ao número de acertos. E aí, o que a gente fez? A gente foi naqueles 90 pares de frações e comparamos ele pela gap, analisamos ele pela gap. E o que a gente percebeu? Que realmente eles utilizaram a gap também nos 90 pares. Como a gente vê aqui, essa aqui é a categoria de acerto, né? Nos casos incongruentes e neutro, eles tiveram um índice de acerto menor. E em relação ao tempo, eles demoraram muito mais para avaliar os casos incongruente e neutro do que os casos congruentes. Então, acho que a própria intuição falou, alguma coisa tem errada nessa estratégia, né? E, por fim, nós utilizamos o teste de comparação dos spinners para analisar a questão dos formatos não simbólicos, né? O Roberto já apresentou antes para vocês, nós utilizamos vários spinners e classificamos em relação ao formato, ao número de partes e em relação ao tamanho. O que chegamos como resultado? Primeiro, que o tamanho dos spinners foi um grande influenciador para eles. Quando a gente tinha spinner, a maior fração em spinners menores, eles tenderam a se confundir, tá? E quando a gente colocava particionava esses spinners nesses casos, mais ainda complicou para eles, porque eles tenderam a contar, né? Então, eles fizeram a contagem das partes e erravam. Em relação aos formatos, nós vimos que eles não erraram ou acertaram mais em relação aos casos discreto ou contínuo. Porém, o tempo de reação dos professores foi muito mais rápido nos formatos contínuo do que nos discretos, nos particionados. A gente deve isso ao fato de que é mais fácil você analisar a fração quando ela está no formato contínuo do que particionada. Talvez o particionamento te dá uma tendência a contar, a fazer algo que faz você demorar um pouco mais. E aí, o que a gente chega, então, como considerações finais? Primeiro, eles não tiveram a visão componencial, né? Então, os professores, eles são capazes de não sofrerem o viés do número natural, eles tiveram uma visão holística, tá? E isso a gente precisa tentar levar para os nossos alunos, né? Essa visão, esse conceito de fração. Em segundo lugar, os resultados sugerem que eles fazem uso de muitas estratégias para comparar, por mais que a gap tenha sido a estratégia mais utilizada por eles, eles fizeram uso de diversas estratégias, eles adaptaram muito a estratégia para cada caso, né? Então, talvez a gente precise trabalhar essas estratégias com nossos alunos. Se a gente fizesse um trabalho, os professores juntamente, para listar essas perspectivas de comparação e criar estratégias de ensino para levar isso para a sala de aula, faria muita diferença no conhecimento desses alunos, porque a gente não tem esse livro didático nenhum, né? Então, essas estratégias que os professores trabalharam, a gente não vê em livro didático. E é um conhecimento existente, nós precisamos organizar elas e validar, né? No caso da GAP não é válida, mas a FIT é válida, então talvez transformar a estratégia da GAP para a estratégia FIT, adaptar ela. E a gente entende que quanto mais a gente munir os nossos alunos com diferentes estratégias válidas, mais capazes eles vão ter de obter sucesso no processo de entender a magnitude delas, né? Então, a gente precisa trabalhar com questões que instiguem o pensamento intuitivo, né? Para eles conseguirem aprender esse conteúdo. Sobre as frações não simbólicas, os dados indicam que quanto os professores foram mais rápidos e, consequentemente, talvez seja mais simples eles avaliarem formatos contínuos. Então, talvez a gente adaptasse as nossas aulas, né, os nossos exercícios, com figuras, em vez de particionadas, né, em vez de trabalhar com parte todo, a gente focar em formatos contínuos, né, para que a gente utilize essa noção intuitiva que as crianças já têm e mostrada até no adulto, né? Então, talvez seja a hora da gente adaptar um pouco as nossas estratégias de ensino, ok? Bem, pessoal, é isso. Estou aberta aí para discussões. Meu e-mail está aí. Qualquer dúvida podem me enviar, tá? E eu agradeço a todos que estão aí ouvindo a gente hoje.
Our next presentation will be Dr. Maria Lisi. Afterwards, we will open things up for questions, so you can begin to construct your questions and send them via the chat. Thank you.
I am Professor Maria Alice, and I'd like to present some contributions, limits, and challenges of teaching fractions from a measuring perspective using the lesson study. Lesson study is a Japanese technique for teachers to construct mathematics lessons collaboratively. They design the lessons to address students' learning difficulties or teachers' pedagogical practice. Fraction is one of those mathematical content that, on the one hand, students have been presenting comprehension problems, and, on the other, teachers feel limit in how to teach it. For this reason, two professional enhancement courses aimed to increase teachers' understanding of the content and how to teach it. We carried out two lesson study projects with elementary school teachers from two different Brazilian schools, one in the municipality of Serra. With the application of lesson study for classes with students of the 6th year of primary education, age around 11. The other was the municipality of Anchieta. There, the teachers teach to students from 6 to 16 years old. The collaboration of teachers with different experience and backgrounds brought expanded views of the curriculum and the desire for a natural sequence of mathematics throughout schooling. The collaboration was important for teachers in the final grades to know the construction of the concept of fraction with second grade students and, on the other hand, teachers in the initial grades to know the impacts of what teachers do in the continuation of studies in final grades. More than that, the joint planning of classes that aimed at building the concept of fraction with second grade students brought ideas for teachers of later grades about developing fraction ideas with their students. In the middle of the classes about the construction of fraction concept, there are moments of writing equations and inequalities regarding the measures of the rods. This experience naturally introduced the idea of equations and inequalities without mentioning names. It's possible, therefore, that second grade students naturally have the first notions about equations and inequalities. That's right, equations and inequalities of the measures of the rods that were under study. All of this in the beginning of second grade. These two projects in Brazil were inspired and conducted based on the experience I had with Professor Arthur Powell from the planning of fractions classes in a conjunction with American teachers of different backgrounds, schools, and working in various school grades. The planned classes were taught with second grade U.S. students and taught by Professor Arthur Powell. These actions were developed with Cousinet rods to build an understanding that considers the measurement of quantities as a multiplicative comparison of pair of magnitudes. C. The measure of 2 white rods is equivalent to 1 red rod. That of 3 white rods is equivalent to a light green rod, and so on. The motivation for the lesson study projects and the search for alternatives for teaching fractions with Professor Arthur originated from situations indicated by teachers and researchers from mathematics education, cognitive psychology, and neuroscience. For example, when adding fractions with different denominators, students added numerators and denominators without considering the relationships between the fractions. Instead, they applied properties of natural numbers to fractions. Likewise, when comparing fractions with equal numerators, they tended to say that 2/5 is less than 2/9 because 5 is less than 9. That is, they again disregard the relationship between numerator and denominator in each of the two fractions. The relationship between numerator and denominator is evident when working with measures. C. Always reading from the left rod to the right rod, we have a relation of 2/5 on the left two rods. And on the right two rods, we have a relation of 2/9. The visual appeal says that the red rod represents a larger portion of the yellow rod than of the blue rod. Therefore, among the two fractions, 2/5 is a greater than 2/9. Even so, we can prove this relationship using equivalent fractions. We match the lengths of the yellow and blue rods. Then we added as many red rods in both relations as they were additions of yellow and blue rods in each row. We see that the length of the red rods in relation to the yellow rods is greater than the length of the red rods in relation to the blue rods. It is common that students do not understand improper fractions. Students believe that the number of parts taken must always be less than the total number of parts. Therefore, the fractions themselves are easy to understand because the number of parts taken is less than the total number of parts. But when we need to take more parts taken than the total of viable parts, the difficulty of understanding arises. Students do have understand the idea of an unit. With the Cuisenaire rods, the transition from proper to improper fractions is natural. Reading the relation on the lengths of the rods always from left to right, we have in the first set of rods on the left that a white rod is 1/8 of the brown rod, then 2/8, 5/8, 8/8, 9/8, and 13/80, for example. Observe also how easy it is to realize the relations of half measures with the Cuisenaire rods. Then, when the students see the fractions 1/2 is different relationships, they will realize the same fraction occurring in different units. From a measuring perspective, it's easy to see the difference between 5/7 and 7/5. However, There are some considerations to make in order for teaching to take students to a broad and deep understanding. In lesson study, for teachers to develop lessons, they have to study mathematical ideas, meet to present and exchange perspectives, and finally, to construct materials that seek to meet their education objectives. They have to invest time and have support from school leadership. Lesson study may require reorganizing teaching schedules. The Anchieta team, in my opinion, was the protagonist in bringing together in our group elementary and middle school teachers and school administrators. This enhanced our work since everyone was involved and committed to the lesson study objectives. By participating and supporting the lesson study, school leaders came to know the real needs of those who teach. Elementary and middle school teachers broadened their vision of the mathematics curriculum beyond what is written. An investment of many classes is necessary to build these fraction ideas with students. Often, the pace imposed by schools and the curriculum itself leads to lessons based on memorization and the indiscriminate use of procedures at the expense of developing students' conceptual understanding. The lesson study experiences also pointed out mistakes. We are wrong to think that we would consume fewer classes to build the concept of fraction with sixth grade students than with second grade students. In fact, the pace required was the same. I think that little by little, collaborative teaching can take shape in schools, and more we hear things like this. It looks like math. The same happened in Serra. A student said, I don't like mathematics, but here I am enjoying it. Lesson study is a simple idea, but a complex process. In sum, the contributions of the teaching of fractions from the measuring perspective are evident. Nevertheless, it's necessary that mathematics educators rethink the alignment of the educational objectives with the way the teaching has been carried out. This all has to do with the school culture. Of course, there are limits and challenges. However, these two Brazilian examples and the Newark example leave us with the message that it's possible. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, everyone. So now it comes the time for questions and comments. We really appreciate the attention that you've given us thus far. And let's see if you have questions, you can pose in the chat and we'll try to field them.
So, Dr. Powell, the first question is, a lot of the research presented today suggests that mistakes with rational number fraction comprehension occur because of conflicts with previously learned concepts. Does the strength of this conflict grow with age? And also, do you think it will be harder to resolve these conflicts using some of the techniques suggested in older students?
Well, yeah, this is a very interesting question. I think I'm going to first see if Dr. Miriam Rosenberg-Lee would like to comment on the first part of the question having to do with the growth of the conflict with age?
Thanks for this really interesting question. It's one that we've thought a lot about. And we've seen that some of the non-symbolic conflict seems to reduce with age. And so we've got some work with Rutgers Newark undergraduates, and they seem to show less of that interference effect. But we see that the symbolic interference seems to be really pervasive. It continues in fraction comparison, in decimal comparison. And so we actually have a measure of it in decimals from seventh graders and eighth graders, and they seem, sorry, seventh and eighth graders and adults, and it seems to be the same amount of interference. What seems to be changing in contrast is that sort of that mature representation of fractions or decimals as having magnitude and really kind of thinking about them holistically. That does seem to be increasing, but it doesn't seem that the whole number is going away. So we're working on it, and it suggests that we maybe need ways to, that natural schooling is not going to totally address that issue.
And I'll comment a little bit on this, the question of the conflict with older students. I think that one root of the conflict has to do with perhaps older students relying very much procedurally on things that they've learned in terms of how to operate with fractions, and not have enough of a well-developed conceptual understanding, one that allows them to evoke images that are strong enough that so that they can make these comparisons of the ratios, and that allow them to understand the proportionality that's embedded in our rational number system. So thank you for that question.
A follow-up question from Tiffany Morris. A lot of the research presented today suggests that mistakes, I'm sorry. Do you believe teaching discrete, part of a whole method of fractions, to be a stumbling block to student conceptual fluency of rational numbers?
Let's see, I don't know if Elise would like to respond to that, or, yeah.
Yes, I can. I think it would be best to start by continuous means, because the ontological way is more beneficial to compose the reasoning. So I think it's better to beginning by the continuous way.
And if I can add on, I agree with the comments that Maria Lisi made, and I think what we're seeing is that having these continuous models and looking at the comparison of ratios, first the comparison among quantities, two quantities, in order to see what fractional relationship exists, and then mapping that onto the idea of comparing magnitudes of pairs of ratios, that the continuous quantities lends itself in a way that seems to be more consistent with actually how we are hardwired. But that the discrete is also important, and that the continuous can be a bridge to the discrete. So I think that it would be important to first ground one's understanding of these rational numbers on the basis of continuous quantities. And then when you move to discrete, one can see collections of discrete objects as continuous. That is, they can blend, and you can consider the count of the continuous sets as a continuous length, for example. So I think that the continuous will provide the basis for understanding the discrete. Thank you for that question.
Okay, great. Regarding the correlation between intuition and learning difficulties, is there any benefit to directly teaching skills to change intuition? Does intuition develop as students learn?
So that's a really good psychological question, and I think I'll leave that to our psychologist.
Like a good psychologist, I'm going to say we have to define our terms. I think the question here maybe comes down to sort of what's intuition and what's intuitive. And I think for a long time, people have operated under the assumption that counting is intuitive and sort of enumerating is intuitive. And so fractions are hard because they go against our intuitions about enumeration. But now we're sort of starting from a different perspective, which says that maybe we have some intuitions about counting, but we also have a lot of instruction and approach, which is teaching counting and telling students that it's important. And we might have some other intuitions around things like ratio or proportion, that we're sort of, in a way, we're kind of, our current system is sort of teaching people to suppress that in favor of the counting information, right? You know, we want kids to say, oh, I've got more, having, more cookies is better than having one big cookie. And maybe in the process, we've sort of pushed against people's natural intuitions. So I think that, maybe it's not so much about changing people's intuitions as sort of building up other intuitions and maybe not trying to suppress them, but rather integrate them, because both are important. We're not going to stop kids. We're not going to stop teaching kids to count. We just also maybe don't want to do it to the exclusion of these other maybe intuitions that they have.
Did researchers engage students from classrooms where multiple symbol systems, similar to the fraction lessons in the trials, were used in teaching whole number knowledge? If so, did those methods influence how students learned fractions?
So in the work that we conducted with second grade students in Newark, we worked with them in an after-school context, and they had, of course, contact with whole number instruction in their first and second grades. And in those, they worked with symbolic representations of whole numbers. And so they brought that with them into the work that we did with them, so that there were certain things that we didn't have to teach them because they knew how to represent the number 5, the number 7, for example. We did have to teach how to represent the relation 5/7 symbolically. So that work that they had with whole number symbolization did carry over to the work that we did with them. But I'm not able to say to what extent that prior work that they had shaped the work that they did with us. That's something that I don't have information about. It wasn't something that we were looking into.
The next one is an affirmation or confirmation in the form of a question. So the teacher's asking, if I understand, I should be talking about continuous and bridging discrete to overcome the issues of improper fractions.
Yes, that would be a recommendation based on the work that we've done. That is, first of all, some of the symbolic work that you saw on a couple of the slides that I presented, the students wrote those as being, well, those are fractional relations that they saw between these continuous quantities. They did not think of the improper fractions that they wrote as being improper fractions. They just understood that one length was longer than the length that was used as the unit of measure. And so it happened to be written as 7/5. So they didn't yet have language that allowed them to discriminate between proper or improper fractions, or even mixed numbers, though they wrote all of those. So they were just thinking in terms of the fractional relationships and then learning how to symbolize them. I'm not sure if I got to the essence of the question. Whoever asked the question can come back and restate it. You're on mute, Darlene.
How does a student's difficulty with estimating the result of the problem impact their understanding of the task?
So I'm wondering if that's in relation to one of the presentations. Maybe Roberto might want to try and respond to that. I know that Maria Alisi is having some difficulty with her internet. Is Roberto still with us?
Yes. Darlene, could you repeat the question for me, please?
Certainly. How does a student's difficulty with estimating the result of the problem impact their understanding of the task?
So in particular, we can see it from the perspective of non-symbolic. So participants can take different strategies to solve the non-symbolic task, in particular the spinner's task. One thing that they could do is estimating the proportional information of the spinners. Another strategy could be counting. For if participants, instead of estimating the proportional information, take other strategies as counting, then the performance will be really low. And in some particular trials, like for instance, when information is at odds, when proportional information is at odds with the proportional information, then they might actually get all of them incorrectly, because all of the counting information will be leading them to the incorrect response. And this is sort of to say that, yes, of course, if participants are not estimating the correct magnitude, in particular for the spinner's task, the proportional information, then the performance will be really low. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yes, I believe so. What could be a better approach while teaching to avoid the gap between learning number concepts and learning number symbols?
So I think one way is to spend a lot of time having students talk about the numerical relationships that they encounter in the materials that are being used in class, whether they be Cuisenaire rods or some other set of materials. They may be counters, they may be other kinds of materials, so that they develop a discursive fluency in talking about the relationships. And that we recognize that, particularly for young students, say in grades 1, 2, and 3, when we move them to writing, writing for them is still a laborious motor skill that they're developing. And so we want to first be sure that they have this verbal ability to talk about relationships and that they're fluent before we engage them in the act of writing, where they're going to have to use all of their attention in the formation of the words and the formation of the symbols, right? And so we want, at least when they're writing, for the writing that they're doing to be of things that they are thoroughly familiar with, so that they're not at the same time trying to think about things mathematically, while at the same time having to master the particular motor skills of writing. So I think we need to separate those two. I don't know, Miriam, maybe in some of the work that you've done with other researchers, you have something to say about this distinction between developing conceptual understanding and writing.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one and also one that I've thought a lot about lately because, of course, students are doing much less writing and much more typing. So it'll be interesting to see if there's any kind of impact. I mean, there's of course going to be many, many impacts that'll be, that we'll be studying for years. But it does occur to me that sort of all of that practice that students get writing numbers is maybe not going to be as strong for the kids who've gone through this. That may or may not have an impact on their ability to make a mapping between the symbols and their representation. So, the subtext of what we're saying here is that sort of when people are working with symbolic fractions, they may be evoking kind of mental images, and the mental images that they're going to have may depend on their experiences in school. And so if we can find, if there's a representation that sort of most closely matches what they might do intuitively or what people who are really good at this do intuitively, then it might support them in better learning. And so I think that part of sort of making that mapping is going to be a lot of kind of going back and forth between them. And one approach that I really think is interesting in Dr. Powell's work is this a part where you sort of imagine the symbols. So it's not that you're sort of stop thinking about the symbols. Sorry, you imagine the non-symbolic, you imagine the rod. So it's not that you stop thinking about the visual representation when you get the symbols. It's more that you sort of tie them on and use the things that are obvious when you're looking at physical objects. You evoke those in your mind, and then you label them, and then you write them. And I suspect that process may be very helpful in kind of building up that those relations and avoiding a gap between the symbolic and the non-symbolic. So I don't know if that helps get at some of those ideas.
Yeah, thank you. Darlene, there's a comment here by Dr. Riley that I think that contributes to this discussion.
Sure, I'll read it for everybody. It says, rather than have the children write, assistive writing could be used. The teacher writes what the students are orally composing. This assistance can become less supportive as students gain greater clarity with writing and the concepts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting scaffolding way of helping students move into writing. And then Johnny Turner asked the question, what about a tool where students record their responses with a tool like Flipgrid or Screencastify?
Castify, yes.
Screencastify, yeah. So that's a very interesting comment because in a project that we're now engaged in with Newark and another school district called Vista in California, the project's called Mathematical Thinkers Like Me. We are wanting to use the tool of Flipgrid in particular as a vehicle for students to tell stories about their mathematical problem solving so that it becomes another vehicle. These will be middle school students, so they have the ability to write, but it's another vehicle for expressing their ideas in addition to being able to write them down. And there's ways of creating situations where students using Flipgrid are not only storytelling, but maybe even acting things out. So I think that such a tool could be very useful.
What is the impact of a lack of understanding of fractions at a younger age to learning and understanding algebra and higher mathematics? And also, in addition to that, how can we best teach students upper level mathematics who may not have a solid understanding of fractions or other foundational standards?
Well, in terms of what are some of the ways in which having a poor understanding of fractions will shape one's algebra learning? I mean, these come in the form of, middle school, where leading into algebra learning, they're working on issues of proportion, ratios and proportion. And so not seeing the distinction between fractions and ratios can be a problem, right? Because we deal with ratios differently than we deal with fractions. Fractions are a special kind of ratio where the units of the numerator and the denominator are the same, but we can have ratios where, the ratios of boys to girls in the classroom, the units are a little bit different. So one, in understanding the distinctions between different kinds of symbols that are used similarly, right? So that's one. The other is that, of course, in algebra, we have rational expressions. And how we handle and operate with rational expressions is analogous to how we work with fractions. So that if one doesn't have an understanding of permissible operations with fractions, then you're going to have a misunderstanding of permissible operations with rational expressions in algebra. And then the issue continues on up the line when one works with probability and statistics, and then with limits, thinking about the calculus. And so these problems just multiply. How do we help those upper grade students in high school, for example, who have less than desirable understanding of fractions? Is we have to help them understand fractions, and we'll have to work with them so that they develop these intuitive and conceptual and procedural understandings of fractions, so that they can be successful with algebra. Because without being successful with algebra, other areas of STEM those doors will be closed to them.
Can I jump in on that one
Sure.
with a couple of tantalizing results from the literature that point in a direction that I think addresses this question. So there is a study that shows that people who are better at comparing these non-symbolic representations, both comparing lines and also comparing sort of sets of dots in proportion, do better at fraction comparison, do better at standardized math tests, do better in their college entrance exam at the University of Wisconsin. So now that's a correlational result. So it doesn't tell us that they're good at those things because they're good, at college math because they are good at symbolic comparison, but it tells us those things go together. And so it leads to the study of, well, what happens if you improve students' understanding of non-symbolic representations? Does that lead to symbolic improvement? And a few studies have shown that, at least for comparing symbolic fractions, but we don't know, if that leads to a kind of snowballing effect for all the way up to college algebra. But we did find in our own work that students who were better at comparing the 0.9 versus the 0.36 and all of those different versions had better, college students had better overall math scores. And it, in particular, though, it was the kinds of math that is measured, other kinds of fraction understanding, rational numbers, so fraction operations and division. So it suggests that these kind of more basic skills may help you with more complex skills, mostly for the reason that if you if you haven't understood these basic things, it can be very hard to then work with these things effectively because you're just maybe doing it in a manipulating symbols kind of way and not in a sort of deep understanding way. So tantalizing results, but we don't know the full story yet.
Is being a visual learner have an impact on understanding symbolic versus non-symbolic numbers?
Could I jump in on this one too?
Absolutely.
And I saw there was also another question about procedural learners. So without going into too much detail, I'll just say that there's a big debate in the literature about whether these ideas of visual learners versus procedural learners, kinesthetic learners are meaningful distinctions. And it's certainly true that you can ask people about how they learn and they can identify in different ways, but but the research hasn't confirmed an idea that like, oh, well, if you teach visual learners in a visual way, they will learn better than if you taught them in a language-based way, for example. And I can tell you that the brain data shows that we're all visual learners, we're all auditory learners, we're all symbolic learners. Our brains do all of these things, and we all have the capacity to strengthen each of these aspects of our understanding. So I think that we can sort of maybe perhaps sort of move beyond thinking about students in different kinds of categories and thinking more about using multiple methods of teaching for multiple to sort of help students develop rich understanding.
Do any other participants have further questions? You explained the use of parietal lobe in terms of blobs of activity. Have you studied or would you consider the impact of how older students have been unpacking their complex learning than younger students?
So I was using blobs in a little bit of a colloquial way because that's in fact how scientists sometimes use it. But I think it's a little bit overly informal, and really what we're talking about is statistical significance of activity differences in specific regions in the brain. I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I think perhaps it's sort of what happens if we look at brain activity patterns at different ages, and those results are very interesting. I presented some of them showing that we maybe all can sort of process non-symbolic representations for whole numbers pretty young. It takes a while to build those up for symbolic representations. And I am so disappointed to tell you that there are no studies of fraction processing in children. I have a grant to look at decimal processing in children, so I hope to come back to you guys in 5 years and tell you that story. But I think it's a really interesting question about what happens when people are first learning this material versus have a lot of experience with it. And I will also tell you that most of the studies that have been published in adults involve, I think, undergraduate students and graduate students at European universities. And so they may be very, very good at these kinds of tasks. And what we don't even know is like what's happening in the brain when you're processing fractions, when you are, when you really don't understand them versus you have a really solid understanding. We're really interested in how we can use the brain to understand what's going on, why it's so hard at earlier ages and why it gets easier at later ages, but doesn't ever become sort of completely fluid, even for older students. I hope that answers your question. If not, please feel free to write more.
Well, I think I'd like to thank everyone who has participated today. I know that for teachers in particular, we're at the end of the school year. We're in the middle, perhaps, of doing district testing, and also the rigors of the pandemic has put a lot on our plates. We really appreciate your taking time out of your busy schedules to be here with us today. We're hoping that the information that we provided has stimulated some new thoughts and interests in pursuing some of these ideas in further depth. We will continue to collaborate and are very, very thankful to Director Darlene Gerhardt and to everyone in the Office of Mathematics, as well as the Newark Board of Education generally for their welcoming us and participating as partners in the work that we've been doing. So we really, really appreciate it. I know that Rogeria and Maria Alice were having some problems with their internet. Perhaps there's something going on with the signal in Brazil, but on their behalf, I also want to thank you for your attention.
I'm here.
Oh, okay, you're back. Okay. So I don't know if you want to say anything in closing.
Oh, yes. Thank you for participating here. I wish that everyone could have enjoyed our studies and be able to experience them with their students. So, good luck.
Thank you. And Rogeria?
Thank you, everyone. Yes,
Thank you.
it was a great evening. Thank you.
Roberto, I don't know if you want to say anything.
Thank you so much for your attention.
And Miriam? There you are. Okay. I think Miriam has left, or is she?
Continue this section. Having difficulties. So.
Yeah, I can hear it. The voice is choppy. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Darlene. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a great night.
Thank you.